Good morning and welcome to Hanover's latest online event and part of a series focused on culture, diversity and inclusion. We're delighted so many senior financial services leaders are able to join us and continue what's been a very successful series of online events since the start of the year. Why do we do them? It is part of our drive to raise awareness and encourage conversation about the opportunities and challenges of culture, inclusion and diversity. It's an area of focus for our clients and increasingly investing a lot of time and money into, and it is a big focus internally for Hanover as well. Firstly, some introductions. My name is Zoe Campbell. I'm a partner in the insurance practice and Hanover's Culture, Inclusion and Diversity lead. I'm joined by my colleague Linda Dale, who is a partner in our investment management and technology practices, and of course, our guest speaker, Alexandra Haggard, whom I'll introduce shortly. For those who don't know Hanover, we are a global provider of talent solutions with a team of over 60 people and have been working with clients for over 25 years. Our head office is in London and we have a presence across Europe, the US and Asia. We specialize in 3 talent-related areas: executive search, helping clients, organizations find first-class leaders and subject matter experts; leadership solutions, helping clients to select and develop high-performing leaders, build effective teams and plan succession; and market intelligence, providing insights and answers to key talent-related questions about salaries, structures and competitive benchmarking. In summary, Hanover's expertise is in helping you to find, select, develop and deploy the very best people to grow your business. Before we hear from Alex, I'd like to share some key points. This event is being recorded and will be hosted online, so people who couldn't make it today will benefit from the content. Everyone should be set to mute, but please remain muted throughout to avoid any background noise. Following my introduction, Alex will present for about 20 minutes. During her presentation, please feel free to share any questions or comments via the chat box in Zoom, and Linda will put your questions directly to Alex during the Q&A session. Our guest speaker today, whom we're delighted to be joining us, is Alexandra Haggard. She has kindly agreed to share her knowledge and experience across the disability spectrum as a whole. Alex is a founding member of the Diversity Project, established in 2016. It is a grassroots, action-oriented organisation aimed at driving diversity in fund management, amplifying conversations rather than replicating them. The Diversity Project brings together over 70 member firms spanning asset owners, investment consultants, asset managers, wealth managers, and industry bodies such as search firms in an intense programme of work streams, which focus on many aspects of diversity and inclusion. Alex is co-lead of the disability workstream, partly as a result of discovering in 2018 that she herself is disabled. She is now leading a project to encourage 30 investment firms to become disability confident by the end of 2021, to bring down the barriers to people with disability entering. And
I'm going to start with my journey with disability, but also with diversity, and then try to reframe the conversation in terms that make it clear that disability is very close to home for all of us. And therefore, even if it's only from a selfish perspective, we should all be doing more. My first diversity awakening looked a bit like this. It was 6 years into my career, and until this point, I had progressed pretty rapidly within my organization, thanks to a series of wonderful bosses, many of whom, but not all, were middle-aged white men. My version of this was finding myself in a room of male executives, all of whom were at least 10 years older than I was, and all of whom had wives who didn't work. I was trying to lead conversations on my subject of expertise, but I couldn't get myself heard. I was different, and the group just couldn't figure out how to include me. By luck, I actually figured out how to make myself heard. And it was by working with an acting coach who's an absolutely amazing woman. Her name is Anna Ostergren, and she helped me find more effective ways of communicating and of making myself heard. I developed techniques for group meetings, for one-to-ones, and for influencing. I even changed the way that I use my voice. Once upon a time, I spoke in a register that was actually considerably higher. It was a lot of work, but over a number of years, it's really paid off. I continue to be different to a number of my colleagues, but I've found ways of bringing my differences in a way that's more easily understandable for what we tend to think about as being the majority. While I was going through this period and working on how I conveyed myself, I also started to develop my own thoughts on diversity, which, to start with, were predominantly focused on gender. I ran the Women's Network for the firm that I worked at. I spoke on panels, and I generally learned more about what good inclusion looks like and also what it doesn't. In 2015, I moved to Stanford Associates, and I met Helena Morrissey there. I think we could probably all agree that she is a giant among humans, and her ability to drive a national conversation on diversity is unparalleled. And along with two other people, Jane Welsh and Sarah Bates, the four of us decided to create an organization called the Diversity Project. The idea was that it would be the next step on from the 30% Club. And I'm sure all of you know about the 30% Club. The purpose of it was to try and drive inclusion of women among non-executive directors for the top FTSE 100 companies. What we wanted to do was have a similar impact on the investment management industry. We wanted to do it all the way through the career ladder, so not only focused on non-exec roles, and also to have it really be 360 degrees of diversity, so moving beyond the simple gender dichotomy. And so we were targeting the savings and investment industry. So this is the Diversity Project. And now we are 4 years into the life of it. And we're an organization, as Zoe mentioned, with over 70 member firms. And we're driving a diverse and inclusive investment and savings industry in the UK. The way that we're organized is with 12 work streams focusing on different aspects of diversity or different career stages. So for example, we have disability, we have ethnicity, and then on the career stages, we have women returners, we have early careers, and then we have a specific work stream thinking about female portfolio managers. One of the main ways that we work is actually by partnering with existing initiatives that exist. And we try and bring organizations together so that we can share best practice or create it where it doesn't exist. So for example, we've worked with a charity called Scope to create a toolkit for firms who want to do a better job of attracting and retaining people with disabilities. Overall, what we're doing is we're helping to create a more diverse and inclusive industry across all aspects of diversity. Now, one of the challenges that I had been noticing, although perhaps it wasn't as obvious to me as it should have been, was that there were lots of quite loud conversations, which included gender, which included ethnicity, particularly in the last year, and also LGBTQ. But one of the things that has really struck me is that in the financial services industry, certainly, we don't really talk about disability that much. And it was in a conversation with Diversity Project colleagues that I had a moment of self-reflection. I can remember it vividly. I was sitting in a meeting room on the top floor of the London office of my former employer. I was sitting with Jane Welsh and with Sarah Bates, and we were interviewing candidates for a charity trustee role. And I happened to look up the definition of disability. It came as a real shock to me to realize that as defined by the Equality Act of 2010, I have a disability. There are a couple of reasons why it came as a shock. First of all, I was, and frankly still am, quite ignorant about disability. I knew very little about it as an element of diversity or as an experience. But more importantly, I think I responded the way that we're conditioned to, which is with an assumption that to be disabled is to be less than, which certainly isn't the way that I think of myself, or indeed how I want others to think about me. So why was I so shocked to discover that I was disabled? It was really because of how it made me feel about myself. And I think that's because there's a bias against disabled people, which most of us will have, and I certainly still did and arguably still do. There's a really interesting term that I think that all of us should become more aware of, which is ableism. And the idea is that you use it in the same sense as racism or sexism. And it means a widespread unconscious or conscious bias against a particular group. But in this case, it's a group of people who are disabled. And there are some really widespread examples of ableism, which we probably will all recognize. So for example, you work with someone who's deaf and you always refer to them as my deaf colleague. Or you might use what are considered ableist terms. Now, I have to admit that I use crazy a lot, but I'm trying not to actually, because if you think about it, it refers to a significant mental illness. And using that as a term on a day-to-day basis probably isn't going to be the best way of trying to normalize people talking about mental illness. You might also assume that disability is only things that are visible. And you might actually be thinking, gosh, she looks totally normal. How could she possibly be disabled? But actually, a lot of disability is invisible. Another way is to think about whether or not you are ever condescending about people who are disabled and their bravery. And here's a thought for you. What if people don't overcome their disabilities, which tends to be the way that this is portrayed in the media, but instead, actually, what they're overcoming is ableism, which makes their daily life hard to navigate because very few accommodations are actually made for these people and their differences. And a final one that I'm certainly guilty of, which is why I really struggled with my own realization of disability, is that one really does assume that people who are disabled aren't as capable as able people. I'm not saying that everybody does all of these, but I suspect that all of you will recognize at least one of them as being something that happens in your day-to-day life. And so where does this lead? Why does it matter that we all have, or that most of us will have these traits? I think the biggest problem with ableism is that most people are prejudiced against people with disabilities, and it can be at different levels of explicit or implicit bias. And I'm certainly trying to get past this, but I know that if I see somebody with a severe physical disability, I will find it difficult not to make negative assumptions about their ability. And yet there are infinite numbers of examples of why I'm wrong. I only have to watch the Paralympics to know that most of the people on that are far more talented at sport than I am ever going to be. The impact of these biases is that they tend to lead to exclusion, and they can also lead to poor policymaking or a lack of funding in government. So this is something that we should all be thinking about more, but what I'd like to do now is make it feel a bit more real and a bit closer to home. The thing about disability is that although some people are born with it, many people who are disabled by the end of their lives don't start that way. And in that way, it's quite different to gender or race, which are broadly fixed throughout your life. So on the basis of selfish probability, it's something that we should all be engaging with far more actively because it's apt to affect us. And so here what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and change the frame of how you think about disability. Under the Equality Act of 2010, you're disabled if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. Now, let's imagine, actually, I don't have to imagine, I know that most of you will drive, most of you read, most of you look at computers a lot for your job. And in fact, 75% of people in the UK either wear glasses or have had laser eye surgery. And without them, lots of us, wouldn't be able to perform our normal daily activities. But what if you didn't have glasses? Or what if you hadn't had surgery? Would you still be able to do your job? Could you actually perform your daily normal activities? Imagine how difficult that could be. Now, fortunately, glasses are readily available, and so now is laser eye surgery. And therefore, people with visual impairments broadly function completely normally. And actually, so much so that it's not actually considered a disability anymore, according to the Equality Act, unless your condition is extreme. But let's just pause for a minute and imagine that you couldn't work because you couldn't see. And that's what having a disability feels like. And you could see that right now, that's somewhere near 75% of the population who could conceivably fall into that category. So not only is visual impairment highly prevalent, but actually disability more generally is. The statistic that strikes me the most significantly is the rise of disability with age. 45% of adults over the state pension age are disabled. So that's just under 1 in 2 of us on this call who will be disabled at the state pension age. So again, this is a call that we should really all pay more attention. And in fact, disabled people are actually the world's largest minority group, and there are 11 million people who qualify as having a disability in the UK. And yet there's such a big disparity between the number of disabled people in total and the number of working-aged people who have disabilities in employment. And the difference between the 46.3 people, the 46.3% of working age people with disability in employment versus 76 people who are not disabled is really striking. But let me give you another figure that's even more striking that's not on this page. The Disability Project did a survey a few years ago, and only 1% of respondents self-disclosed as being disabled. So I really think we have a problem, and I think that we need to do more. So the question becomes, what can we do? And there are opportunities for us to do things as individuals and also as organizations. As an individual, my best advice to you is to start where you are and to seek to improve. This is probably my favorite piece of advice in life, which is to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And here, what you do is you can use the muscles that we have all already developed as we've thought about other types of disability, like of diversity, like race or gender. I'd also suggest that you think about not using disability-related language in non-literal ways. And also to simply speak more about disability and to make it be something that's part of the conversation. And you can also seek out first-person accounts and learn more about what it is like to have a disability. Organizations have even more power to work on disability than individuals do because they can change more in one go. And if organizations were able to more visibly incorporate disability as one of the aspects of diversity that they're working on as firms, that would make a huge difference. You could also think about what structures you have in place to make your workplace more accessible to disabilities. And then you could seek support from organizations who are experts at doing this, like Scope or like the Business Disability Forum. And then the final one, which is one that I want to spend a few minutes on, is to consider joining or signing up to the UK's Disability Confidence Scheme. The idea behind the Disability Confidence Scheme is that it's a series of 3 steps that the UK government has put together that will help organizations signal more obviously that they are disability welcoming organizations. To become level 1 of disability confident really only means that you have actually given it some thought, and it's all on the basis of self-disclosure. The second stage requires you to put some more formal plans in place and to articulate exactly how you are going to be helpful at bringing people into the workplace. And the third step is the most challenging, but only insofar as it requires you to have your disability work audited in terms of how you're going to help people come into the organization. The Diversity Project is trying to get 30 organizations accredited by the end of next year. And I know some of your organizations will be members of the Diversity Project. And so I would certainly encourage your organizations to engage in this conversation where they haven't already. We're really only kickstarting this project in January. So if they haven't heard yet, that's not entirely surprising, but I certainly hope that we'll be able to make enough noise that they do. And so with that, I wanted to also share, because one of the best pieces of advice I can give is to do a little bit more learning. Here's a short list of some of the places that you might go if you wanted to learn more about disability. There's the Scope charity, there's the Business Disability Forum, or the Disability Confident Employer Scheme, amongst others. And with that, I think we'd love to open it up to questions.
Thanks ever so much, Alex, for that. It was very informative and a really interesting view of disability and raising awareness across how many of us could potentially be considered disabled. I mean, I'm wearing glasses, as you can see. I certainly wouldn't want to be reading a computer screen without them. But you did talk about encouraging companies and obviously individuals themselves to start engaging with disability as part of inclusion. I mean, how do you think companies need to start communicating, and what are the key elements about the engagement process to create that heightened awareness? Because, as you said, we've got LGBTQ, ethnicity, gender that have all been in the headlights, dare I say it. But this is something that's very much more under the surface. What are the key things that you feel that companies should be doing to engage employees?
Yeah, Zoe, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that companies find is that they're really worried about getting it wrong. Which is so often the case also with with other conversations about different types of diversity. And so my first piece of advice actually is to find an organization that can help you, because there are actually lots of organizations who can. And then what you need to do is think about the impact of welcoming people with disabilities into your organization throughout their entire careers. So one of the questions is, how can you make sure that you're not either consciously or unconsciously suggesting to people with disabilities that they would not be welcome during the hiring process? Once you've hired somebody, you need to make sure that if there are any accommodations that they need to have made for them, that you've made them. And there you really need to not wait to be asked for accommodations. You probably need to actually start that conversation yourself. You need to make sure that that throughout their life, and potentially all of us, our lives change while we are in employment, and that therefore if their circumstances change, you're able to have an open dialogue about it. It's also quite helpful if it's quite visible that you support them, and that you have role models for people with disabilities. That it's not a case of just perhaps having one or two people, because it's I think we all want to try and stay away from any sign of tokenism. But having role models sort of further up an organization of people who have who have these types of differences is really helpful. That's just a few things that people might be able to think about.
Thank you. One thing that's sprung to mind is that obviously during lockdown and COVID, a lot of companies are looking at their office footprints. I mean, do you think this is a good time to be considering how they make their operations and offices more accessible, and what should they be looking at? Yeah,
absolutely. I think there are so many opportunities right now, actually. I think there are a lot of silver linings to the pandemic, and this is one of them. And another one is the substantially developed ability to work remotely, which can also really benefit not just people with disabilities, but people with many different life circumstances. In terms of going back to the office, I would certainly encourage organizations to think about at least getting the basics right. So things like being wheelchair accessible, having doors that can be opened with buttons. There are lots of different aspects. I think that the challenge, and going back to the beginning of the conversation that we've had, is that there's so many different types of disability that you potentially have so many, such a wide range of accommodations that are necessary that it's difficult to know where to start. So I think having some quite simple basic ones, like being wheelchair accessible, is key. And even just doing that, I say just, can sometimes require quite substantial remodeling. And then after that, you really need to be focused on then who you have in your organization and what types of accommodations they need.
Thank you. And one last question. I mean, how do you encourage senior leaders to really have this open dialogue about disability, and perhaps even sharing their own experiences?
It's such a good question, because disability is certainly still something that is thought of. I mean, it's sort of, I talked about it in my circumstances. It's something that I worry about, talking about my own disability, just being really candid. And so, but I think the more of us who talk about it, the better it will get. And in some cases, like everybody's tipping point is different for when they become engaged in the conversation. And that's why I've taken the approach today of trying to make it more immediate to people. And that might be a way, because where, for example, if you've got a white male senior executive, it's reasonably unlikely, although not impossible, that he's going to become a Black female executive, but he could definitely become disabled. And so I think that idea of proximity and that idea of maybe slightly scaring people about it is one of the options. I'm not sure it's necessarily the right way, but you never know, it could work.
Thank you. Linda, I know we've got some questions in the chat box, so I'll hand over to you.
Oh, thanks, Zoe. So Michelle O'Sullivan was just asking, she said that she would be very interested to know if there are any industries or companies that are leading the charge on this initiative and, how we could learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so within financial services, St. James's Place actually is one of the organizations leading the charge. And within the diversity project in the work stream that we're working on, we're collaborating with them very closely. So absolutely. More generally, from an industry perspective, I have to admit I'm not as familiar. But we are certainly trying to learn where we can. And actually, one of the things that we're planning on doing with the disability work stream is to partner with an organization that is expert in this to help get these 30 organizations sort of over the line of being disability confident.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Alex. And also a comment from Una, which also just plays on one of the statistics that you outlined, which was that only 1% of disabled individuals actually self-disclose. So her question is, what advice would you have to encourage individuals and employees to identify this information?
I think so self-identification as being disabled is quite scary. And I can speak from my particular perspective in that for the first 2 years after I realized it wasn't something that I talked about, and even where I am today, it won't come as you'll have noticed that I haven't actually told you what my disability is because actually I'm not ready. I think, and part of that I feel it's a personal choice, but at the same time, I do sometimes slightly feel like I'm letting the side down because if I can't talk about it, then who can? But this is part of my journey that I'm working through. In terms of things like surveys, I certainly would encourage people to respond. I feel the same way about company engagement surveys. If you don't put your hand up and say sort of where you are, then it's really difficult for people to be able to do anything constructive. So, for example, if we don't know that we have a certain percentage of people who are disabled in the industry, then we can't target them as effectively. I think that the interesting thing about the 1% is it means that the number of problems we have are really significant. I'm sorry, that's not a very helpful answer though, other than that we should probably all be talking about this much more.
Yeah, it's a great answer. And I think it's, just being aware, definitely. And how can businesses change the negative attitude towards disability so that great talent is not overlooked?
So again, I think getting help from experts. I mean, so much of what we all do on a day-to-day basis is about being experts in our own fields. And there are organizations out there who are experts in helping organizations make significant changes to the degree to which they are both welcoming and able to retain talent that is diverse in any way, but specifically with respect to disability. And so organizations like the Leonard Cheshire Foundation or Scope or the Business Disability Forum are great places to go. But you do have to be committed to making the change because cultural change is hard. And you only have to think about all of the other aspects of diversity to realize how long it can take. So we've been talking about gender differences now for decades. We've been talking much more loudly about ethnicity in the last 12 months. And I think we just all need to keep working on it. And it's a question, it's both organizations and individuals who collectively are going to be able to start driving some change.
Thanks, Alex. And Andrew Watson asked, should companies make their suppliers or their partners accountable for internal diversity, inclusion and culture, and also disability awareness? So
I think that that is a brilliant thing to aspire to. And different organizations are going to be at different stages. So I think that's definitely, but I think that's definitely the direction of travel. As it's a component of ESG analysis for companies, but we are still, I think we're such a quite early stage of the ESG journey still, despite the amount of conversations that we've been having around this, and we can't expect everything to change instantly. But certainly, putting your money where your mouth is and having asset owners or people looking at their supply chains can only be positive.
Thanks, Alex. And this isn't exactly a question, but I think it's worth sharing. So Tanji Morgan just said, really interesting presentation, Alex. We're all working longer and age brings on disabilities, eyesight, and frankly, seeing and reading a computer screen all day absolutely declines your eyesight, no question. So, and I guess one question, which hasn't been asked, what do you feel the number one thing is that all organizations could do to create better disability inclusion?
Golly, if I could only pick one thing.
Sorry, Alex.
Well, I'm going to slightly cheat and I'm going to say sign up to being disability confident, because it has so many different impacts across all of management. That would be, if I could change one specific thing, that would be it. Okay,
fantastic. Thanks so much, Alex. And I'll pass over to Zoe now.
Thanks, Linda. And everyone in the audience, feel free to ask any questions, because Alex is obviously hugely knowledgeable in this area. The one thing that struck me when you were talking, you were mentioning obviously the Disabled Olympics, and we've seen all the help that's gone to the military individuals coming back from various areas that have led to horrific physical disabilities, but also psychological disabilities, which has helped to raise awareness. But it seems to be in pockets it's in these silos that people are helping on the sports side and on the military side. But am I right in saying that the sort of, dare I say, the Joe Blogs is getting left behind?
Yes, I think that would be fair. I think that because it's something that collectively as a society I would argue we're not doing enough about, then it follows that there are people who are being left behind. And so if you think back to those employment statistics, there are a lot of people who are unemployed, much higher for figures for people with disabilities than people without. And those are going to be the people who are really struggling and who we need to do more for. And in many cases, these will be people who are utterly brilliant and could be a great source of talent for our industry, but for the fact that we don't know how to help them first through education and then into our organizations. And it's by having more conversations like this that we can try to normalize the position that those people are in, and make better accommodations and find ways to help them live lives that have more options.
No, I agree. I mean, I think, you talked about government funding that's obviously lacking, and there's a huge amount of initiatives, especially around ethnicity at the moment. We've had the 100 black interns, which has gone to 1,000 black interns, now 10,000 black interns, but we're just not seeing the same level of conversation, discussion in the disability sector.
No, we're not. And I certainly wouldn't want to tone down the conversation that we're having on ethnicity, because I think that that's something that is so colossally overdue. And also, like, we won't be able to talk about all of the different aspects of diversity at the same volume all the time. But that doesn't mean that we can't all be pushing in the background, so that, if there comes another type of tipping point where there's an opportunity for us to then massively amplify the conversation, we're ready. And we can take that moment and really change the national dialogue.
Thank you. Tanya Morgan has asked a question. Does your research show generational differences in self-identification?
I haven't come across anything that suggests that, but that's not to say it doesn't exist.
Because I think, as you said yourself, you have to be very brave because of the fear of ableism that is entrenched in the just in life, to say I'm disabled, because it may put up so many red flags to companies that just aren't ready and prepared, to deal or to assist people coming on board and joining.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think it's likely that there will be a differential, and I think companies are starting to make strides in this direction and make themselves more accessible. And there's actually a conversation about people being disabled in the workplace, which certainly there wasn't when I started. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was a difference. I found it quite difficult to find statistics around disability that I could really lean on, apart from really high level ones. But if anybody's come across any brilliant ones about that, then I'd be really interested in seeing them.
Thank you.
Great. And we've had another question come up from Sarah Waters. Firstly, she said, great talk, Alex. What about improved mental health awareness? It's a huge disability. How can we benchmark progress on disability awareness?
So, you could do an entire talk. In fact, you could probably do like a year's worth of talks on the importance of mental health and disabilities relating to mental illness. I think we go back to the data question. That's self-assessing as having a mental illness is really scary. And so trying to to having more conversations about it and normalizing it is essential. And this is actually where I think there's a lot more progress. There's now a much higher incidence of people having mental health first aiders in their organizations alongside physical first aiders, which I think is a brilliant step forward. And also a lot of people's, if you are fortunate enough to be employed in financial services, many organizations will have employee well-being hotlines where you can phone and speak to somebody if you're having difficulties, or you can have the benefit of using your medical insurance to address mental health issues, which historically were really poorly covered. Which isn't really answering the question though, which is how do we do a better job? Again, it's having more conversations and making it more normal. And the more people we see standing up and acknowledging the fact that they are struggling, or that they have mental health issues, and also that they've recovered from having mental health issues, the more we will be able to make progress. But such a great question.
Thanks, Alex. I think we're just still working through that as well. And, the more facts and figures we can have on disability, the better.
Yeah.
And not exactly a question, but just wanted to say, so Carla Hennison commented, seeing her son struggle with ADHD, has made her want to do a bit to raise awareness of others. So yes, maybe the role of being a mom has helped her open up about both his journey and her journey. So I think that's what both, yeah, correct. So
I think absolutely just this, I think this idea of being in such, like, I think we're all in very close proximity to some kind of disability. You know, as if you use the Disability Act of 2010 as a definition, and I think that's why I feel like there's such an opportunity now that we're having more conversations about being more open and more authentic or more vulnerable. That there's this great opportunity for us to do more about this. And Carla, I think your example is spot on.
Great. I think that's all the questions. So I'll pass over to Zoe again.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you ever so much. I mean, Alex, I just wanted to know if you had any closing comments or thoughts that you just want to end with.
Thanks, Zoe. My final comment is that we all have the opportunity to make a change around all aspects of diversity and inclusion, and that if you pick one and put one foot in front of the other, we all have the ability to really drive change. And so I would encourage you to do so.
Thank you, Alex. It's been a really interesting presentation. So thank you ever so much, because I think we look at disability in different silos and don't think of it as a whole. So thank you for that. Thank you for everyone that's also attended and commented and sent some very interesting questions. And also, I just wanted to point out Vivian Hole has agreed with Carla that ADHD is a topic close to her heart. Her son has learning difficulties, and schooling was a battle. Now he's an adult and working, but from time to time he faces challenges because people can't see what his difficulties are. This issue of self-categorizing is a sensitive one. I know she knows that her son has faced the dilemma when applying for jobs as to whether or not to declare. So I think you're right, Alex. This is about having far more open, transparent dialogues about disability in the round. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for attending. Alex, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. Hanover will be sending out a quick feedback survey. We'd be very grateful for your comments, which we can pass back to Alex. And if you'd like to be connected with Alex, we can obviously assist you with that. Lastly, on behalf of Alex and Hanover, we'd obviously welcome the opportunity to follow up with you all and gauge your interest in this area. So thank you ever so much, and we'll now close the meeting.